Aloha, fellow truth seekers, philosophers, and friends. I am Shasta, and welcome to today's episode of Philosophy in the Forest. I am coming to you from the beautiful Puna Rainforest on the big island of Hawaii, and I'm actually sitting in one of the last acres of unspoiled rainforest in the Hawaiian Paradise Park neighborhood. So, this is a very precious and last standing forest. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the essential teachings of the Buddha, some of the ideas of the Eightfold Path, and some of the ideas about wisdom and compassion. So, the Amida Buddha is the embodiment of wisdom and compassion, but that's actually us. We are that Buddha. We are the embodiment of wisdom and compassion, and we all have this internal, Buddha within us that we can call upon and that gives us this capacity for eternal compassion. And this is important to remember because one of the greatest, teachings of the Buddha is that life is full of suffering. And when we come into a realization of that suffering and of all of the things that happen around us in this world that we can't control, the Amida Buddha, reminds us that we have within us an infinite well of compassion that we can draw upon. And so the next thing is this idea of wisdom. And from compassion, the Buddha teaches that wisdom is this profound understanding of reality, and a lot of Buddhism is about coming to the core of thinking and coming to a deeper understanding of, what reality is, what is truly going on. Because when we learn the truth, we can apply more compassion. Because with the truth, we can understand levels of suffering, we can understand cause, and from there, a lot of healing can happen. So this wisdom is, the Buddha's wisdom, the wisdom of sages, the wisdom of generations, the wisdom of nature, the wisdom of plants, the wisdom of animals, the wisdom of mistakes that we've made in our lives, the wisdom of past choices that we've made, and this idea of equanimity. Equanimity is like seeing things as they are, coming to profound realizations. So a lot of Buddhism is about waking up, coming to terms and to grips with reality and to think, to be deliberate in our actions, to no longer run on this like sort of autopilot, hot, cold, fight or flight, not this, just constantly in avoidance of pleasure and avoidance of negative experiences. And so this wisdom is like, it's the pause. And in this pause, we're able to come to a better state of thinking and understanding. And so next we have the idea of compassion. And compassion, it's not always the easiest thing, because it involves, not only sympathy, but coming to terms with things as they are, and then coming into a new way of being, which is like focused on loving kindness. So although things are a certain way, it's to approach them rather than with fury or with indecision or fear, to come into a new understanding of loving kindness. And that's not pity, it's not sorrow, it's an acknowledgement of suffering. It's like a full understanding that suffering exists, and then from there we can take on more social, ethical, and moral responsibility, knowing that we're not alone, because everyone and everything and every living thing is struggling. And so it becomes this like kindness, that expands out, and it's loving kindness that then gives us the space to pause. And in true loving kindness, we can even look at actions that we don't like, in a way that is compassionate. And that is probably one of the more difficult things about, the Buddhist path, is this compassion for actions that we don't like. And that doesn't mean condoning them. For example, I live in an area where there's a ton of deforestation. I mean, I live in the last unspoiled acre. I've seen 20 acres of rainforest destroyed in 5 years. And it's difficult to come at that kind of destruction with compassion. But the compassion that I have is knowing that many of the individuals and the humans alive today who are, causing ecological destruction might not be conscious themselves. And it perhaps hurts a lot. And the hurt and pain that they put on the external environment is actually just symbolic of their own, lack of compassion for themselves, and then lack of ability to expand that compassion out. And so once we reach that state of like internal compassion and sympathy for others, it's nirvana. It's pure enlightenment. It's a state of not necessarily needing to change things, but recognizing where they are and how everything is perfect just as it is. And that our ego doesn't necessarily need to be constantly involved and constantly engaged in these ideas of resistance, and that we can come to peace with these things and come to peace with our own existence of our own isness, come to peace with where we are, whether we're sick or whether we're healthy, or whether our mental state is good, or whether we're suffering from addiction, or whether we have a broken leg. It's all just another state of being. And within that state of being, we are here together, sharing every single moment. And it's the realization that life is full of suffering, and the realization that we're here still, and that we have a place. And this comes into this idea of like peace. So to let go of the self, this is emptiness, the no self, that there is no permanent self. I mean, think about yourself yesterday. Think about yourself 4 years ago. Think about, who you think you're going to become. And all of these are just constructs of the mind and definitions. And it's okay to have an ego. It's just that with these definitions of self, we can suffer. We can suffer because we get attached to who we think we used to be, or who we think we should be, or how we think we should be, when really we just are as we are in the present moment. And so the self, as we've constructed it, really is an illusion, and it's created by ourselves. It's our greatest art project, is this thing, the self. We're like onions, so we can just peel away the layers of ourself and find in there this sort of inner Buddha, the Amida Buddha, the embodiment of wisdom and compassion. And in Buddhism, it becomes the life work to understand and recognize, where the ego is toying with us, where the ego is seeking for control, seeking for definitions, seeking to pull us out of our connection to everything. The ego is constantly demanding respect. It's constantly, giving with need of receiving. And, if we can just let go of that and maybe just reflect on the self, try to find gratitude in our day, living in the moment, allowing the moment to be this peaceful, wonderful, wherever it is or whatever it is. And even if it isn't a peaceful moment, maybe you're at the DMV, just allow it to unfold. Maybe, soon I'll be watching my neighbor destroy a forest. one that means so much to me. He's going to come and he's going to knock down all these trees. But I still have my forest, right? I still have my core. I still have my peace. And it's very difficult. It's so difficult. People live in ashrams so that they can find peace. And for those of us who are civilians who live in the material world, we have to come to a point of understanding that all we can do is become more compassionate, understand that there are, and not be judgmental, but understand the three poisons: greed, anger, and ignorance. And these are the trappings of the ego. The ego is greedy. The ego gets angry, and the ego is ignorant. And then to apply that compassion back to others and understand that they're poisoned. And what would it feel like to be poisoned? And am I poisoned? Do I have greed? Do I have anger? Am I ignorant? And I can reflect upon my own life, and I can say my poison is probably anger. I have a lot of anger for the way that things should be. And in should, the anger comes with that word should, right? Should. So it's a lack of acceptance on my part. And it's easy to intellectualize these things and conceptualize these ideas. But the real peace comes is when the Buddha came up with these four noble truths as he was sitting beneath a tree, so legend says, sitting under a Bodhi tree, that everybody's suffering, and that this suffering is caused by desire, and there's so many different roots of these sufferings, with three poisons: greed, anger, and ignorance. That creates pretty much all the suffering that we have in the world. And that we're judgmental and selfish. And, with a lot of the ecological destruction that I see around me, it's pure selfishness. It's usually to turn a profit, so there's greed. Destruction itself to me is an angry act. So I look at it that way, and it's obviously very ignorant. It's ignorant to the point where it's not, it's neither thinking in the now nor thinking in the future. Most people would think, oh yeah, well, they're only thinking about now, but they're not really thinking. As people are destroying and polluting rivers, they're not really thinking about the now, because so much destruction happens in that moment. And so, we live in a world that's full of greed, and we live in a world that's full of anger, and we live in a world that's full of ignorance. So for those of us who want to end this suffering, or to find peace, or to find a way to live in this world, we have to just realize that this suffering has a root cause, and to not be judgmental, because that will cause our own suffering, and then we'll get caught up in the wheel of karma. So it's a constant battle. Whether or not we see suffering or we see actions that we don't like, there's that judge. And the judge makes us miserable. And then when we're miserable, we carry that misery with us out into the world, ad infinitum. So the Eightfold Path just says that we can put down that suffering. The Four Noble Truths says we can recognize this suffering, and we can release that suffering. That being judgmental and ignorant causes suffering. But release of suffering is a finding of truth. And when we find truth, we begin to see things as they are. And in that, we have a lot of freedom, because we have less resistance. And so this comes to the Noble Eightfold Path. And the Noble Eightfold Path is the right view. So to see things as they are, to see things clearly, to have the right thought. So to act with thoughts that aren't poisonous, to see the world and everything as it is, and not as we believe that it should be, to eliminate that word should from our vocabulary, to have the right intent, to have persistence and passion, and to do things with the idea that it's the journey and not the destination. And right speech. so important. It's a recognition of the truth, the recognition that idle gossip hurts people, that repeating rumors is often an unconscious action, that being thoughtful is a way that we can unite others and heal each other. And then of course there's right action, do ethical things, don't create harm, don't kill, don't lie, don't steal, all these like Abrahamic faiths come into like just this one parameter of like right action. But it's not about judging others if they don't act rightly. It's about approaching our own actions with more compassion. And then of course there's right livelihood. So, that's like dealing in slaves, obviously. It would be like the greatest example of a livelihood that was not in line with Buddhist principles, doing things that harm animals, that harm plants, that harm others, maybe even foreclosing on people's houses. Maybe that's not a great livelihood to have. Maybe there's a better job that one can do. And so we have this right effort. So when all of these things are put together, we can cultivate this enthusiasm and a positive attitude where we become more balanced, and we're like a finely tuned musical instrument, perfectly in tune, playing that G chord, because if one string in the guitar is out of tune, it doesn't sound musical. And so this right effort is without judgment, going forward with a cheerful demeanor and determination. And the cheerful determination isn't a lack of recognition of suffering. It's knowing that there's suffering and knowing that the cheerfulness and that this effort is a small way to alleviate it. And then there's right mindfulness, which is really hard, to sort of grasp because it's very ethereal, like what is the mind? But it's just being aware of where we are at the moment, being aware of our restrictions, being aware of who we are, being aware of what we're doing, keeping our focus, staying in practice, knowing what we're thinking. Am I being judgmental? Am I being hurtful? And then there's concentration, right concentration, the concentration of the mind, the benefits of mindfulness, and how, once we see how much mindfulness gives us, it's the idea of continuing that practice and to leave our mind uncluttered and to not hold judgments for long periods of time, and to not hold anger with us, and to find ways, if you are angry, and I am often, to find ways to move that anger. And I use music, I take walks, so that we can teach our mind how to see beauty and how to suffer less. So thank you guys for joining me in this rather long discussion about Buddhism, but I've enjoyed it with you. And Panchi says hello, and thank you guys. Aloha.